joined today by Katie Byard and Sophie Gosling of Recolo. So Katie is the, a clinical director and one of the co-founders of Recolo, and Sophie is a clinical supervisor. So thanks very much to both of you for doing this.
Pleasure.
So I'm going to pose questions to each of you. So Katie, perhaps you could start by just telling us a little bit about Recolo and the sort of work that you do.
Yeah, I work with a fantastic team of clinical psychologists and educational psychologists, and we deliver psychological input to children, young people and their families, and into schools for children who have had a brain injury. We work with children who have had a brain injury that's part of a medico-legal claim, and that actually gives us a huge opportunity to work deeply and for long periods of time with children and young people, and also to come back in at key points as well. So at key transitions, whether it's a developmental transition, moving particularly from a family environment maybe into the community, or at periods during their scholastic career as well. So moving, say, from junior to senior school. And yeah, I think I'm very aware that, you know, the time that we have to work with young people gives us, is a really privileged position.
And you work with teenagers right up to the age of 18, do you?
We actually work beyond that.
Okay.
Yeah, and it kind of fits with this idea of a brain that continues to develop well into the 20s, and seeing a young person as a developing person. And so, you know, actually understanding that you don't have this cutoff at the age of 18,
yeah,
but you work developmentally, and as a service and individually as psychologists working with young people, will gauge the point that it feels appropriate to stop and to kind of move to a more adult neuropsychologist frame for that person.
Okay.
And I also think just working across those key transition points, going from college into potentially university or work or voluntary work, it means we can smooth that path rather than them just having, we're saying, right, we're going now. It means that we don't have to have that cut off, so we've got that flexibility to stay with that young person through the often tricky transition periods.
Yeah, yeah. So just thinking about COVID, lots of the interviews I've done recently, it's obviously a bit of a theme, and other rehab providers that I've spoken to about them working remotely, doing assessments and follow-ups by video. They paint a mixed picture, so it's not all negative and it's not all positive. So Sophie, could you say something about how you think the nature of rehabilitation has shifted for Recolo in particular?
Yeah, so since September we've been using a blended approach. So we do still mainly remote, but we are doing some face-to-face work as well. And I think one of the key things is that we've obviously had to introduce a very comprehensive risk assessment to support those processes, and we thought very carefully about when a face-to-face meeting is going to be necessary for the client. We've had to think very carefully because we are a national organisation, so we've got varying infection rates across the country. So considering local measures, as well as thinking about what the family needs, how the family feels about working remotely versus face-to-face, has been really key for us. And I think another key area has been the effect of COVID on people's mental health, on their emotional well-being, on the child's education, and rehabilitation has to shift to take those things into account. So whereas we might have been on a track of goals and thinking this is what the rehab looks like, we have to be really flexible and really listen to what the needs of the families have been. I think we've particularly noticed it's hit, not surprisingly, the most vulnerable families the hardest, and they've been perhaps the most challenging to support. what I have been impressed with is how much we've been able to work with local statutory services to support those families. I've had personal experience of working with one family where social care has been very heavily involved, and it's been a very, very good working relationship. So people have really stepped up and worked together as a team.
Right. Katie, anything you wanted to add to that?
I think I'm aware, speaking to a lot of my colleagues and just in my own personal work as well, and because I have lots of conversations with Sophie as our clinical lead, and within that what we're recognizing is we're just having to be so flexible, and really on a week by week basis sort of check in with ourselves, but also with the families that we're working with, what's going on geographically in that location, and be very sensitive to that and make that part of our risk assessment on a week by week, that our emotions might be changing and that what families are dealing with might be changing. You might suddenly have COVID in the family home, for example, and then that makes a real difference on how on what we can do and on whether we can even do a face-to-face meeting. And so and also that's within the MDTs as well. I'm finding that within the MDTs that I'm working with, we're having many more conversations about what is this feeling like, what is the most appropriate thing to do at the moment, and not looking too far ahead, even in the sort of goal setting that we're doing.
I think that's the same for everybody in the country, actually. You can't look too far ahead at the moment. So I'm interested to know how it's been for both of you individually as practitioners, providing a service to your own clients, looking at some of the positives and perhaps also some of the negatives or frustrations for each of you. How's that been?
I'll start, and I think I've said in other webinars, I was a bit of a grunt box about technology. I didn't want it. I didn't want to even embrace it. I'm not very technologically minded. It takes me a really long time to learn new stuff. I get easily flummoxed in the moment, and I quickly run out of what can I do to solve this problem. And so I was really quite distressed at the outset and felt stuck. And what I quickly found, and actually it was through attending other webinars, listening to other people, listening to my colleagues, I began to see quite quickly what was possible. And I got help where I needed it. I got the support to kind of learn the skills that I needed to learn. And what I've noticed is that there's a lot more that is possible than I first thought. And actually with some of the teenagers especially that I'm working with, they appreciate a screen much more than face-to-face. They're attuned to it, they understand it, it's their language, it's how they communicate and interact with people. And from that perspective, I found actually it can be really engaging for teenagers and young adults. And I think for us as a professional group, we've worked hard together to find solutions, and because of that, actually I've only seen it as a positive part of our service, because it means we can offer more at a time when actually the country has been shutting down or it has felt difficult to provide services.
That's interesting, isn't it? The thing about teenagers or children and screen time, on the whole, we see it as a really negative thing, I think, generally, and there's, children and teenagers spend way too much time in front of a screen, and yet you present it like that, and it's actually, in these circumstances, very, very positive. So that's good to hear. And Sophie, how's it been for you?
Again, I think I just thought, right, we've just got to get on with it and give it a go. I must admit, even with clients that I've known for a really long time, I was nervous about doing some of those first remote sessions, and I had it all planned out really, really carefully, much more so than I normally would. I had everything, had loads of materials, and I was kind of thinking, right, I need to be really creative and dynamic. And there is definitely an element of that you have to plan more, that you do have to think about, right, what are we going to do next, and have things on hand when you're working with children. But I think we've learned really, really quickly. I think the other major thing that I have noticed, and this has been particularly a piece of work that I've done to support a young person to go from junior school to secondary school, the transition has been, as the case manager said, one of the best that we've ever done. And I think that is because we have been able to meet regularly. The school staff have been on board. We've all been able to find times when we can meet. We've met frequently. We've troubleshooted things as we've needed to. It's been a much more responsive way of working. If we had to all try and get together and be in one place at one time, we wouldn't have had as many conversations as we had. And it's meant that that transition has gone really well for this young person. And we've continued to meet on a much more regular basis than I think we would have done otherwise. So I think I've seen some real advantages for some of the pieces of work that I've been doing. That's not to say that there haven't been some challenges for other families. And I think particularly when perhaps their technology isn't as good, or their Wi-Fi isn't as good, or they just don't feel as comfortable with technology themselves, we've had to be more flexible. So just going back to the good old-fashioned telephone, speaking to people on the phone and remembering that we do have other ways of connecting and continuing to stay connected with people, I think has been, very, very important. So yes, I've been pleasantly surprised.
I'll just add one extra thing. I think one of the potential risks of remote working for professionals and society at the moment is pacing. So what I'm noticing is, not just in this sector, but in all sectors, everyone's working from home, everybody's got used to working remotely, and there's this challenge now of how do we transition from space to space? How do we use our time? How do we not get completely fatigued by being in front of a screen? And so that's something I think as professional groups we're going to have to support one another with, so that there's that expectation of, just because we can have a Zoom today because I've got an hour, if I've had a Zoom in the morning, another one later in the day, do I really want to have Zooms all day? So that's part of what we need to learn about how to use remotely as efficiently and effectively as possible.
You can probably hear I don't know whether you can hear my cat in the background joining in.
Yeah, but, she agrees.
She agrees. Yeah, it's obviously one of the upsides or downsides of working from home. What I forgot to say at the beginning is that we're going to do 2 parts to the interview. So that brings us to an end for part 1. And thanks very much for joining me today. And we'll see you again in part 2. Thank you.